I remember that day so clearly. Anxiety was squeezing my chest, but there was also a twinge of happiness, an emotion I never imagined I would feel again. It was my daughter Emma's wedding. She was beaming, about to experience one of the happiest moments of her life, and I was supposed to be the support she needed. But deep down, I was struggling to stay calm. It wasn't just the event, but the weight of everything I had faced before. I didn't know if I was ready to deal with yet another big change. My heart was beating fast as I walked through the hallways of the Grand Plaza Hotel, the marble and crystal reflecting a light so intense that it seemed to blind my eyes. What seemed like a dream to everyone around me, to me, became an overwhelming reality. A whirlwind of emotions, a mixture of pride and fear, and the pressure that everything needed to be perfect. I couldn't make a mistake. After all, my daughter deserved the best, didn't she? But at the same time, I was lost, with the memories of so many past difficulties, wondering if I would have enough strength not to fall apart that day. It was as if the space around me was shrinking, making everything even more oppressive. Each step down the aisle felt like an eternity. The weight of my personal history, of the scars I carried, followed me like a shadow. Emma's long-awaited wedding seemed to be forcing me to face all my insecurities. I no longer knew who I was exactly in that moment. I was not the perfect mother I had always imagined myself to be. Instead, I was a woman full of doubts, fears, and, as much as I tried to hide it, with a huge hole in my chest, caused by years of unresolved challenges. But when I looked at Emma, standing there at the altar, radiant as ever, something began to change. She was there, living her dream, and all I could think about was how I could help her live a life as full as hers. And suddenly, I realized that I could no longer live my life weighed down by the past. I had overcome so much to get to this point. I was no longer that broken woman, defeated by adversity. No, I was standing there with tears in my eyes, but with a heart stronger than ever. I needed to remember that. I needed to remember how I had always managed to move forward despite the hardships. There, in the midst of that stunning ceremony, the realization hit me like a stunned storm. Emma was no longer the little girl I had raised her to be. She had become a strong, independent woman, ready to embark on her own journey. And I needed to find that strength within myself, too. I needed to reconnect with the woman who had weathered so many storms and who was now about to witness the greatest moment of her daughter's life. I could not allow myself to wallow in fear. I could no longer let the past define me. What I did today, how I positioned myself, would be the legacy I would leave for my daughter. Suddenly, a sense of calm began to invade my body, a strange but necessary peace. I looked at Emma. She seemed so sure of herself, so confident, and it made me realize that she no longer needed the same mother I had been before. She was no longer the woman who was afraid of what the future held, who feared loneliness or the idea of being inadequate. Emma needed a mother who knew that despite all the hardships and losses over the years, she was still capable of moving forward and finding new meaning. I had learned to be resilient, to transform pain into strength, to reinvent myself. And as she looked to the future with a radiant smile, I began to look to my own future with a clarity I hadn't had in a long time. I didn't have to be perfect. I didn't have to follow what society told me about being a successful mother or woman. Perfection didn't exist. What mattered was the path I had taken, all the internal battles I had overcome, and how, with each step, I had been rebuilding myself. I realized that for so long, I had been living on autopilot, just reacting to what life was throwing at me. But in that moment, right there, I finally decided to live according to what I truly needed for myself. Everything that had happened, the losses, the hard times, the frustrations, and the fear of failure, would no longer be a burden to carry. I had been shaped by these experiences, molded by the pain and resilience I had developed. And now, Looking at my daughter's face, so happy, so free, I knew that what really mattered was the ability to always get up, to rebuild herself after each fall. And above all, to never lose hope. I was not there to be perfection. I was there to support, to celebrate, to be a witness to the strength that existed not only in her, but also in me. The ceremony went ahead with every detail perfectly orchestrated, but I was in a state of deep reflection. As a mother, the expectation of being at the top of my game was overwhelming. So many times in my life I had felt like I wasn't enough, that I was failing to be who I thought I should be. But there, in that ballroom, while everyone else's eyes were on Emma and her fiancé, mine were on me. I found myself finally beginning to understand that there was no single definition of what it meant to be a good mother or a good woman. I had lived my truth, and that was enough. Everything around me seemed distant on another plane. I was, for the first time in a long time, being honest with myself. I didn't need to carry the burden of guilt, insecurity, or expectations of being the perfect image of something I could never be. I needed to be myself, and I realized that by doing so I was giving Emma an example of strength that was truer than any imposed perfection. She could look at me and see that even in the darkest moments when life seemed broken, I always managed to start over. That was the legacy I wanted to leave her, the ability to move forward, the ability to rebuild, to never give up, even when all seemed lost. Suddenly, the idea that I could make a mistake that day seemed so insignificant. I realized that mistake is a construct of the mind, something that only exists when we are trying to compare ourselves to others or with unrealistic expectations. Perfection is not synonymous with happiness. I wanted my daughter to know this, that life was made up of ups and downs, that nothing was linear, that obstacles were just opportunities in disguise. Today, I saw myself as a reflection of all of this. I was not perfect, but I was strong. I was a woman who had found her peace and courage in the midst of chaos, and finally I could truly smile without the weight of doubt consuming me. As the ceremony progressed, I felt as if time had slowed down. The sound of the music, the sparkle in Emma's eyes, the nervous smile of my future son-in-law, everything seemed to merge into a sense of tranquility. However, deep down, something inside me was still stirring, a feeling that I needed to go through one more test, one more internal battle. But when I looked at my daughter, I saw in her the reflection of the woman I had become, someone who knew how to weather the storms of life and even in the worst moments, knew how to rebuild herself. It was there, in the midst of that celebration, that I realized that my true achievement was not in being a perfect mother or a flawless woman, but in understanding and accepting my own imperfections. I learned to forgive myself, to allow myself to be vulnerable. For so long, I lived with the weight of an image I wanted to project, afraid that people would notice my weaknesses. Today, when I looked at Emma, I knew that she would never expect perfection from me, because she knew me deeply. And most importantly, I knew that she would also learn to accept herself, with all her strengths and weaknesses. She would grow up knowing that true strength lies in vulnerability, in the act of moving forward even when life challenges us. The sense of pride that washed over me was indescribable. Emma was about to take the next step in her life, and I knew she had the strength she needed to face whatever came her way. But I also knew that this strength did not come from me as her mother. It was not the support I had always imagined would be the key to her success. The real gift I had given her was the ability to learn from my mistakes, the freedom to be imperfect, the courage to rebuild herself after each setback. I realized that while I thought I should be a perfect mother, it was my example of overcoming obstacles that helped her grow. In that moment, while everyone around me celebrated, I felt a peace I had never felt before. I was no longer trying to be the mother everyone expected, or the woman society idealized. I had finally freed myself from the invisible chains that had imprisoned me. I was there, with Emma, watching her daughter grow into a strong, confident and self-assured woman. I knew that she also carried within her a part of me, of my story of resilience, and that just like me, she could overcome anything. She had, in me, an example that no matter how much life knocks us down, we can always get up and start over. The ceremony ended, and as the guests made their way to the banquet, I stood there for a moment, taking in the magnitude of everything that had happened. I had been through a painful process of self-discovery, of overcoming my own limitations, but I finally felt at peace with everything that I was. All those years, I had always sought validation from others, the approval of everyone around me. But right then, in that moment, it was as if I had finally given myself that validation. I didn't need the approval of others to feel complete. I was already enough. I had overcome so much to get to this point, and that was already a triumph. When the party was in full swing and laughter and conversation filled the air, I began to walk among the guests with a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer that tense, insecure woman, afraid of being judged. There was no longer room for that. Constant anxiety. The emotion I carried now was a mix of gratitude and understanding. I was living a unique moment, but at the same time, I understood that it wasn't the end of anything, but the beginning of a new phase in my life. And most importantly, I realized that what Emma needed from me now was not an idealized version of her mother, but a woman who knew the importance of reinventing herself. As I watched Emma's happy moments with her fiancé, a sense of accomplishment washed over me. This was not just a wedding, but a milestone of transformation. Emma was ready to follow her own path, and at the same time, I was ready to follow mine. From that moment on, I knew I had more to offer myself. I didn't need to live trapped in the past, in mistakes, in guilt. Life was challenging me, and I, with all my imperfections, was ready to face it with renewed courage. I always thought that the greatest gift I could give my daughter was a secure, flawless future. But over the years, I realized that the greatest lesson I could pass on to her was that life is full of ups and downs, and what really matters is the ability to learn from each experience. When I looked to the future, I no longer saw an endless road of challenges, but a series of new opportunities to grow. And most of all, I realized that I didn't need to have all the answers. I just needed to keep walking, knowing that true strength lies in keeping going, even when the path seems uncertain. As the guests danced and celebrated, something inside me told me that this was my moment to reclaim what I had left behind. I had lived my life as if I were just a supporting role in someone else's story, always trying to please, always trying to make everything work out for everyone around me. But that day, something changed. I realized that the story of my life was not defined by the expectations of others, but by my ability to be true to myself, to embrace my journey with all the imperfections that made it unique. Emma was dancing with her fiancé, and I was there watching, my heart filled with pride and a sense of lightness. I finally realized that my daughter didn't need a perfect mother. She needed a mother who was genuine, who had the courage to be who she was without any pretense. I wanted her to know that at the end of the day, the greatest strength anyone can have is not in never failing, but in having the courage to start over after each fall. That was the truth I wanted to pass on to her. That life is not about never making mistakes, but about learning from each mistake and moving forward. Suddenly, I felt a warmth in my chest, a sense of clarity so intense it almost took my breath away. I was no longer lost. I was there, with all my weaknesses and strengths, with all my scars, and yet completely alive. I had overcome so many adversities, so many internal battles, and I never thought I would get this far. But in that moment, as I watched my daughter, I knew that the greatest victory was mine. True overcoming was not in an event or in an acknowledgement, but in the ability to look to the past and still believe in the future. I was ready to embrace that future, without fear of what would come. As the night wore on and the stars shone brightly in the sky outside, I found myself reflecting on what it truly meant to overcome. It wasn't just about the external struggles, the ones that come to us from the outside, but about the internal battles, the ones we fight alone. Throughout my life, I had always feared falling, the moments of weakness, as if that would define me. But now I knew that falling wasn't the end. I had always managed to get back up, and each time I did, I became stronger. I no longer needed to be afraid of my weaknesses, because they were already part of who I was. As I looked at Emma, I felt an immense love. A love that was no longer just that of a mother for a daughter, but a love of understanding, of mutual acceptance. I knew that just like me, she would face life's ups and downs, and I knew that she would learn to be strong, not by never failing, but by always getting back up when life challenged her. I wanted her to know that there was no shame in having doubts, in making mistakes. The shame was only in the idea of never trying, of never giving yourself the opportunity to grow. I knew that she, like me, would make her own journey of overcoming, and I would be there, not to stop her from making mistakes, but to support her every step of the way. I was no longer the woman who was afraid to fail. I no longer had to carry the burden of unrealistic expectations about what a mother or a woman should be. I had overcome that. No, my overcoming was not in having all the answers or in following other people's standards. My overcoming was in the act of allowing myself to be who I am, with my flaws and strengths, and being able to look back and realize that even in the hard times, I always knew how to find a way back to myself. I was no longer afraid to follow that path because I knew it would take me exactly where I needed to be. The night seemed to be drawing to a close, but I couldn't help but think about how far I had come. For years, I had looked back on my life with a sense of failure, that the pieces never quite fit together. But now, in the midst of Emma's wedding celebration, everything seemed to make sense. I had overcome my own limitations, faced my fears, and most importantly, learned to love myself in a way I never imagined possible. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was a transformed woman, ready to embrace life without the weight of the past holding me back. As the music began to play softer, and the lights in the hall reflected off the crystals in the ceiling, I felt a deep connection with the present. I was there, in that moment, whole. I was not a version of myself built to please or meet expectations, but an authentic version, with all my marks and scars. I knew that my journey of overcoming would not end that day. It was an ongoing process. Every day would be an opportunity for me to continue rebuilding myself, and that gave me a sense of freedom that I had never experienced before. As I watched Emma dance with her new husband, I could see her becoming the woman I had always known she would be. And it was in that moment that I realized how important my example of resilience had been to her. She had grown up knowing that life was not about perfection, but about resilience. I had taught her to see hardships not as barriers, but as challenges to be overcome. She had a strength within her that I knew would sustain her, just as I had found strength in my own scars. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests began to say their goodbyes, a sense of fulfillment washed over me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, I was at peace with it. I had learned that life didn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. The struggles I had faced, the scars I had carried, had all led me to this point, and every experience, good or bad, had contributed to who I was today. I no longer had to fear being imperfect because my authenticity, my ability to be true to myself, was what made me strong. I was finally ready to live the future, without fear of making mistakes, without fear of failing, because now I knew mistakes are just part of the journey, and they do not define who we are. What defines us is the courage to continue, to keep moving forward, even when things don't go as planned. My daughter now had her own life to follow, but I knew that the legacy I wanted to leave her was not one of perfection, but of perseverance. I taught her to get up after every fall, to never give up, to always believe in tomorrow, and that day I felt like I had fulfilled my mission as a mother. Emma's wedding was, without a doubt, one of the most special moments of my life, but it was also the turning point, the moment I embraced my own journey, with all the ups and downs that came with it. Not only did I see my daughter begin her own journey, but I also saw my own. I was ready for whatever came my way. No more fear, no more doubt. I had overcome my own story, and in doing so, I showed her that true strength lies in allowing yourself to grow, learn, and move forward, no matter what life throws at us.